Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. Most of us believe, myself included, that home ownership is the perfect blend between achieving your financial goals and your lifestyle goals. However, with the latest rapid run up in interest rates that have all but snuffed out the joy of the latest intake of first home buyers, more people than ever are starting to ask the question, why on earth would we ever want to buy a home? So, in this episode, you're going to be challenged. I know I certainly was by what our guest talks about. Cody Ellingham is an entrepreneur and he's the host of the Transformation of Value podcast. If you get a lot out of this episode, show your appreciation by giving us a big fat old like and a comment and subscribe while you're at it. Let's get started. If it's true, why wouldn't you want to buy a home? We might as well just start on that, shall we, Cody?
Yeah, well, we're talking about it as if it's a commodity. I think these conversations around home ownership, it's kind of really made it into a product. It's made it into a financialized asset. But really, what we're talking about here is home, right? And there's something much more deeper to what that means. And I think fundamentally, and I think as we go through this conversation, we'll sort of unravel that. But what does home mean, and how does changes in the way we perceive home affect the way we engage with society, how we engage with each other, and some of the longer term consequences of the financialization and kind of unattainability of this thing we call home. And so really for me, I think home, along with family, is the basis of society, despite what the government may tell you. I mean, we are, social creatures. We have family, we have extended family, and kind of home is a situation, a context where that exists.
Yeah.
And sort of where you call home and your relationship to your ability to access that, I think really has some profound consequences. So my background, as you may know, is photography, right? I lived overseas for many years. I was doing architecture photography, photographing homes and kind of the lived experience. And that sort of turned into an exploration of kind of the state of housing in various places. So I did my first book about public housing in Japan, big, huge apartment building houses that were built after the war, and kind of exploring this idea of, the places we call home. And so I've done a couple of series on New Zealand houses, one of them of which was featured by The Guardian about a year ago.
Cool.
And this kind of idea of place and space is, kind of the visuals of it really inspires me. And I think with home and with houses, we sort of we have this relationship with it now that it's something you invest in. It's getting on the ladder, this kind of language we use. And I think, just to begin with, there's something quite problematic about that.
Let's put it side by side, because I know where you're coming from, and I know that, like, often when I'm helping people to get into their first home or their next home, it's this curious blend of financial and lifestyle that gets melded in there. And it's as much of a financial decision or an investment decision as it is about staking their claim into some sort of physical space so that they feel safe and they feel protected so that they can build something bigger. But when you approach that word called home from a slightly different perspective based on your experiences, what does it conjure up inside of your mind?
Home for me, I grew up in the Hawke's Bay, and I've got these kind of images, childhood, these kinds of associations with home. And for me, really, home for me personally is my grandparents' place in Hastings.
Yeah.
That's the only place that's been kind of consistent throughout my life as a destination. My family moved house many times, but in terms of a home that I can identify with, and that's kind of the nature. My family were renting for many years as I was growing up, and so we kind of moved around. And my parents have their own place now, but there's not that lineage to the land and to a place like I have, say, with my grandparents' place. So for me, that's kind of my, I guess, personal relationship to it. And then that sort of sits, I think, in a place of nostalgia, in a kind of a beautiful place in my memories. But the reality of it today, I was looking on Trade Me last night and just to kind of get an idea of what's going on, and really it's still the market or whatever has cooled off, so to speak. But really I'm over it. It's not about the price. Like I think there's places where, it's maybe, kind of in a distant reality affordable, but it's sort of, the value proposition's not there for me. It's, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and getting closer to $1 million for something that's, livable.
Yeah.
What you can get, or what you're paying and what you get, it's like, I don't know, there's just this huge gap, and it's only because it's been financialized that we can kind of ascribe that value, that dollar value to it. There'll always be demand for, property that's close to a city or that's in a desirable location, but
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just sort of this market forces have, they've done their thing, and, it's a financialized asset, and it's the best way to invest, and historically
Yeah.
has been.
Just break down that word
Yeah.
for those that are kind of coming into this cold, maybe like that when we're saying that it's financialized, I guess what we're really saying is that it's a financial, like it's an asset, and it's an asset specifically that banks will take as security in exchange for giving you more money than what you've saved up to be able to own it. So they will lend against that property, and over time, that act of lending against property, secured by property, effectively turns property into a financial asset, unless you have a better definition than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, that's pretty onto it, and I think, when we're talking about that, really what it is there's a utility, to a house. It's a roof, and keeps you warm, and this kind of basic thing. But then on top of that, the financialization of it, which makes it into a speculative asset, into a store of wealth, and that's probably the one that's most problematic, is as a store of wealth. It's, I mean, I can't imagine the headaches that are involved with managing that. I mean, but it's it's not liquid. It's not fungible. Every house is unique. However, the financialization of that has had this kind of perverse effect where you've got people unable to live in houses because of the dollar value on it has just gone ballistic over the last few decades.
Yes.
And that creates this kind of other bubbling effects, these sort of second order effects. I don't think there's a political solution to this, and I'm not interested in a political solution. That the horse has bolted. I think there's emerging kind of discussions, in sort of my friend circle. You got kind of Green Party staff, kind of let's tax this, let's tax that, and I'm not coming at it from that angle. I'm just kind of over the whole thing, and I'm looking at what the next thing is.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, as much as you're comfortable, like a little bit about
Yeah.
your personal circumstances in terms of if you were looking to buy a home. And so I'm not trying to trick you into changing your view at all, but I just want to understand, like, from an age and stage point of view, do you feel like you are kind of, you want to be free to explore the countries, and you don't really want to be pinned down at this stage, and then therefore you're justifying your views around home ownership for some other reason? Or do you really feel like it's genuinely about the fact that it's financialized and you feel locked out and you just don't, I think your words were, you're just over it?
So I guess the context for this, and again, I mean, there's so much to break down here, but like in the New Zealand context, right? There's, I think the value proposition is not there. Does that mean that I don't want to own a home? No. I mean, I are actively interested in Japan. I'll be going back there in October.
Oh, cool.
And to give you some context, there's some really beautiful parts of Japan. Like when I was there in May, a place called Nagano, which is beautiful. People go there for skiing and all sorts of things. It's like, honestly, it's like, Queenstown, that level of beauty, natural beauty, and just, it's a really nice place, really friendly people. I can get a house there for $100,000, and it's an old farmhouse. It's got maybe some land, in the pine forests, beautiful landscape. A lot of what they call besso, which is like kind of like the batch, but, in the mountains that Japanese people had kind of in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of those places are coming up for sale as, Japan's population shrinks, and, a lot of these houses come up for sale. I mean, I know that's waiting there for me. I'm not worried about owning a home one day. And look, maybe, we'll live in Japan and do that thing over there. There's other parts of the world that really interest me as well. So it's not about not owning a home or not. I think it's specifically the New Zealand context of what I get for $800,000, $900,000 is a mouldy house in Upper Hutt that's falling apart, and it's got black mold. That's sort of the context I'm coming at this from, and
Sure.
the fact that people are going to climb over each other to get that, or they were at least until recently.
Yeah.
In that space. And
Yes.
and then you look at the broader sort of context of New Zealand, like what's the future of this country look like, and do you want to be committed to that for the long term?
Let's dig into that, because what you're basically saying is that the reason why the price is what it is a mixture of the fact that it's financialized, and it's part of a pyramid scheme, which is basically connected to our fiat based financial system. So that's why prices always go up. But then there is this reinforcing, perpetuating belief that there's value that we should all be ascribing like we should all be thinking property is valuable. But when you look at it, you're going at it going, well, I just don't see it. So it's not just about the fact that maybe it's expensive to get in. There's something about the fact that it probably ties you into not only that property, because now you're a slave to the man, slave to the mortgage provider, and you have to work, usually locally, usually, to be able to afford to get the mortgage. You're kind of now trapped inside of that home by the bank, which is inside a country or jurisdiction that increasingly you might not feel super comfortable with. Am I getting closer?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things to it, and I think part of it is the nation building project. I think the idea of New Zealand is anachronistic. Like we're not, we're not in a New Zealand state anymore. We're in this globalized economy. We happen to be these islands in the southern Pacific, and some of us are lucky to be able to work internationally, but I look at the destruction happening with the rural sector, and just, blind government policy. New Zealand is based on the price of milk, and this country was built on the back of sheep and cattle pretty much. And there's kind of this dissonance and this, these kind of mega political social trends that are at play, which sort of see the foundations of the country being rocked. And I just don't think people are really aware of that. And I think there's a certain degree of naivety. I'm not super well travelled, but I've travelled enough to sort of look back at New Zealand and think, we're a developed nation. We've got good systems, but I talk to people about Thailand, I talk to people about Taiwan or Japan or whatever, and they sometimes look at me funny. I'm like, like a lot of these countries have much better infrastructure than New Zealand, by degrees. And some of them, a lot of people would consider still, developing. Somewhere like Thailand, it's a developed country in a way, but it's got developing aspects. But a lot of it is still, far superior to what we have in New Zealand. And it's sort of like, there's this, I don't know, kind of island mentality. And I mean, there's a lot to break down there, but the island is, based on agriculture, based on exports, and we're destroying that sector. And so we have this housing market, which is, this huge wealth store based on basically, selling and buying houses off each other, or renting houses off each other. We have a productive economy, which is, I think, got a lot of issues, and there's a lot of structural changes that are coming into play, with emissions, trading, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's just not this awareness that that's all connected. I just don't see the nimbleness and the dynamism here that's going to be able to successfully navigate the changes that are coming.
I guess there's also this, when there's some sort of anxiety around where the jurisdiction is going that you're in, specifically the country, like if you feel like the country is going in a direction which you're not necessarily happy with, and I know there's a growing portion of people here in New Zealand specifically that are feeling like that, and some of them are taking action and leaving, only to inevitably, in my view, probably come back and then complain that everything has gone up in price. But putting that aside, when you are connecting yourself to the land that you're in, often, at least from a European perspective, it takes the form of staking a claim of ownership in it, and then that is what binds you to that country, and in a hopefully a good way forces you to commit to making that country better by working hard, paying taxes, and hopefully trusting that good politicians will spend it wisely and make the country better in the process. Um, I'm reading between the lines here a little bit, but I'm kind of gathering that for a whole host of reasons, you're not really comfortable where New Zealand is going. And if we were to break that down or unpack it a little bit, what would be, or I guess, where did that come from, or what was the most obvious time where that became evident to you that you didn't like where New Zealand was going?
I think starting off, this can become a political discussion, but I think it's also worth mentioning that I'm over politics. I think the idea of the nation state, I mean, it is a collective hallucination. And I, I like, I think Wellington, where I'm based, is I've got friends here. This is my place. Hawke's Bay is my place. But I have no time for Auckland. I have no time for many other parts of this country. And I think straight away the context of discussing a nation and talking about New Zealand as if it's us, as if it's me, as if we have a connection to these islands. I think that's increasingly, it's sort of like longing for empire. It's longing for some former way of organizing society in which it's no longer relevant. I don't hang a picture of the Queen or King Charles on the wall, but that's the kind of thing that maybe your grandparents would have done. And so I think the allegiance to New Zealand is certainly, for me, is disappeared completely. What is it? The All Blacks and the national anthem, maybe some Weet-Bix, but all of those things are pretty superficial and irrelevant. I look at that sort of collective identity, and really that this has come to the fore, I think, over the last few years. The COVID lockdowns and a few other things sort of contributed to that, but certainly the government's custodying the New Zealand identity and trying to say, we are, that kind of collective language. I think that's certainly disingenuous. That's not us. They don't represent us. And I can still, I enjoy, a lot of aspects of New Zealand society and culture, but I think the nation building project has finished. It's long gone, and arguably it died in the 80s with the neoliberal reforms. And so this idea that you could kind of settle down and have a good life is I think rooted in a previous generation, the generation of my parents and grandparents. And for younger people who are increasingly globalized, they're seeing media come in from overseas. They're traveling more, I think. They're seeing the rest of the world, and they're seeing less barriers between themselves and the other. And I think, man, things aren't so great here, but, I can go to this other place, which I always had this preconception that was, a poor country or whatever, but actually it's great and it's in the ascendancy. And so I think just the context of that, it's not like New Zealand's gone off the tracks or gone off the rails. I think the nation state project, this kind of welfare state democracy thing that, they talk about in the sovereign individual, which I mentioned to you, this idea that, we have a government and we work and pay our taxes and, it's going to be okay. I think that's pretty much, on the way out.
Let's unpack that then. So the sovereign individual, one of the things I saw around that book was like just interviewing somebody was interviewing the author, one of the authors of the sovereign individual, and some of his views that he was sharing were just really, really rubbing people the wrong way. You could read the comments in the comment section, just some of his views. And it reminded me a lot about another book, which isn't too dissimilar in terms of lifting the veil on how things actually work and where things are actually going. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Have you ever read that book?
I am familiar with it. It's about the Fed, right?
Yeah, it's about the origin of the U.S. Fed. And again, like, it's like one of the Bibles, I guess, or the core texts that anybody who believes, I guess, in financial reform, true financial reform, will probably stumble across one or both of those books. Another one would be The Bitcoin Standard by Saifuddin Ammous. And these are great books because they contain some core ideas. The Sovereign Individual, from what I understand, is that pretty much just about, and it was written back in, when was this? 1997, I think it was. Yeah, it was when it was written.
1997, but it's uncanny how much it predicted. If I was to summarize it, really it's a reflection and a study of what the authors refer to as mega political changes. So these are things bigger than, are you going to vote for that party or this party? It's actually things much more impactful, things like technology, climate, geography, these things that impact the organization of society and effectively the logic of violence, which is kind of, people get confused, what does that mean? Effectively, it's, who has the power to coerce and to run society. And so historically you had things like feudal lords or kings or, these different power structures. And over time, they've evolved and changed, and it's been mega political changes, things like technology that have influenced that. And so, the recent example, or, the modern era, really was kicked off with the printing press, which was able to disseminate knowledge in a new way. and so that led to kind of the fracturing of the power of the Holy Roman Church,
Yeah.
and the ability of churches to sort of control society, and it led to this this change in a mega political change that impacted society, and there were things that disappeared along the way, and so sort of prior to that you had this chivalry, the kind of knights in shining armor, all of that stuff, and you saw it just sort of evaporate. And they didn't have a feudal society because of chivalry; they had chivalry because they had a feudal society. And I guess bringing that to today, and I mean, there's obviously a lot more. It's a huge book, but where we're at today is we're in this sort of transition phase from a welfare state democracy, an industrial society of, say, the 20th century, the society of World War II and the atom bomb and putting men on the moon, through to an information society. And the organization of that society changes as you go through that transition. So, the feudal kind of the parishes and these old ways of organizing society, the Greek city-states, they evolved as these mega political changes come downrange. And so sort of, where we're at today, and sort of what the sovereign individual talks about, for the future in this information age, is kind of the evaporation and the disassociation of the nation state. Because really, the nation state is really only in existence because of the centralizing forces of, technology, and the importance of having, the ability to coerce and exert power is only possible with very, large democracies, places like the United States, or even smaller countries. That they're centralized entities, and that's the only way they could exist. Because if they didn't do it, and they weren't centralized, and they weren't, democratic in that approach, then another country would come in and fight them. And so, if it was a nation-state democracy versus a small religious order or a small fraternity or some other way of organizing society, the nation state always wins because it's able to tax people the most, and it's the most productive way to get tax revenue is to have a democracy, a large democracy. And so there's all of these kind of things floating around, right? We've got a industrial base, a nation state, the development of passports, the development of international travel, the development of local national identity. This is all very modern. And it's quite strange in a way. You have something like New Zealand. Like, what does that even mean? And New Zealand's actually kind of the perfect way to look at this, because, at what point did the New Zealand identity emerge? At what point were we separate from the state of Victoria or New South Wales or, Mother England? When did that become a thing? And it really, you can trace it all back. It's only very recent that we had that. And things like national anthems or flags or sports teams, they're all these kind of artifacts of the nation state. If you look at it today, though, I mean, who cares? Like, who even knows what the New Zealand national anthem is? I don't know if the kids even still sing it in school. So there's this kind of historical relationship to nation building, which aligns people. Let's build the railway. Let's be one. And it's a very centralizing power. But right now, where we're at, you look at sort of the politics of the clown world, as they say, this kind of internal tribalism, this internal destruction of the nation state, that's starting to tear it apart. And it's no longer relevant. Like, who's going to go and fight in a war for New Zealand? Like, who's going to line up and sing the national anthem? It's not relevant anymore. And so we're holding on to this nostalgia for the old New Zealand of the 20th century. Yet the reality is we live in a globalized world where the only thing I really care about is just having a passport and being able to go and paying as little tax as possible. And if I can go somewhere where the benefits of living there are better, then I'm going to go there. And, I can lament about the old days growing up and going to the beach. But if the economic reality is not there anymore, then I'm out of here.
There's a lot in that. a lot of good. No, that's awesome. A lot of good stuff in that. And I hope, my sincere hope is that people are mildly perturbed by what you just said there, because it'll get them to think, right? Hopefully think for themselves. Is this true? Is there really some sort of nostalgic vision of New Zealand that we're clinging on to, that we're sometimes fighting for, either ideologically or physically fighting for? Or is it inevitable that the rest of the world is actually changing, and we are witnessing maybe the fall of the nation state system and the rise of I don't know what you call that, like the digital state, or just the
Yeah,
rise of the digital realm, right?
Yeah, and I guess just to bring it back a little bit, because I mean this is pretty intense. What we've just talked about. There's a lot there, and it could kind of seem a bit woo woo, to be honest. But the bigger thing is again the naivety. And let's bring this back. If you live in the Bay of Plenty, you've got your house, you got your boat. You go down to the fish and chip store. These kind of images of New Zealand, and you can put it out there and say, okay, this is New Zealand. This is what I think New Zealand is. But the reality is so far from that now. And you look at the ram raids, you look at the shootings, you look at the killings, you look at the murder, you look at the influx of different globalizing forces, and we're still this island, so we haven't necessarily got the people coming over on rafts like you see in the UK and different places, but there's a free flow of people, and they will make their way here. New Zealand kind of has a really strong brand image, and so people will fight to get here. And I'm not saying that's a negative or a positive. That's just the reality of a globalized world. And so the death of a nation is often found in the birth of a nation. And if you look at how New Zealand was founded, where we came from, the way something like the moa or these giant birds and stuff, they were just so helpless when people came. That's kind of in a way what's being reflected here. I think New Zealand's extremely naive to political influence, to countries that have actually had to fight. And I think when you see that naivety, it's sort of like the moa just standing there waiting to get killed. In a way, I see that. I see that in the way we approach business. She'll be right, mate, kind of stuff. And then if you also look at some of the historical issues around, the land wars and some of these other issues which have, they're boiling to the surface. They've always been there, but they're becoming more prominent. And you think about sort of that relationship to the land, to the whenua, and you say, well, yeah, you can own land here, you can own a house, you can own productive land, but what is your relationship with those workers? If we're pulling them in from Tonga or Samoa, to come over here to pick apples once a year, eventually they're going to want to have a bit of a stake. Otherwise, they're not going to be, happy to just continue being, workers. That's sort of this classic idea that the worker, you can have a landed gentry and the workers will just keep working away, humbly. It's like, yeah, eventually there'll come a time when they'll be like, oh, actually, I want this. I've done enough work. I've built this orchard up. I've built this farm up over many decades working here. My family's worked here. It's time for you to give it to me. And that's I think New Zealanders don't think like that. They don't see land reform. They don't see confiscation of land. They don't see what you saw in South Africa, Zimbabwe, post-war Japan, different places where there was a power structure and then that got broken down and went through a revolution. And I think we're very naive in our ability to conceptualize revolution here locally, because again, she'll be right. We've had it good. Ice cream on a Sunday at the beach. We don't see conflict and that kind of internal struggle as part of our identity. But actually, if you go back, it's there. And the Great Drive through to past to Hamilton and the kind of the Maori land wars, battles with the Taranaki tribes and stuff. I mean, that was brutal fighting. People fought. There was violence there, and it was still it's still in the land in a way. And I don't know, like I'm not making this into a race thing, but it's certainly it wasn't built upon I think of fair principles initially, and we've kind of tried to plaster over that, and I think it will rear its head again as something that's very problematic, and the naivety will be swept. People are just going to be gobsmacked when things like that start becoming more common, I think.
Wow. Okay. And this all is linked, like in my view anyway. What happens in the land happens to the people, but also what's on top of it, the structures that we put on top of it, like the financial system where we have rights to occupy bits of crusts of the earth, like by buying homes, as that almost goes through a dying process, like the current financial system is, in my view, inevitably at some stage. Maybe it's not in the next 5 years, maybe it's in 50 years, I don't know, but it will come to an end. And I think while that's happening on top of land, where these issues are starting to bubble up, it just kind of feels like add it to the list of all these other trends that seem to be coming to a climax.
I mean, ownership, I think, is really the question here. Like, what you have this piece of paper, you have this this I don't know if it's even a deed or whatever in New Zealand, but what makes you the owner of something. And really, it's only through the government's mandate that you have ownership of land. And that's I think a construction that people haven't really critically looked at. But you only have to look back at the Christchurch earthquakes and the EQC, and people being red zoned, and more recently for my experience in Hawke's Bay with the flooding.
Yeah.
Like, you don't own a house that the government has said you can't live in.
Yeah.
It's not yours. You're leasing it off the government, and you're leasing it off. The down payment on that is the idea that there's a government that you believe in, and I think that's where things get a bit messy and a bit kind of strange, because we've seen only recently, say last 10, 15 years, and with Christchurch, this idea that the land, and I mean, New Zealand's geologically active, so there's just flooding, earthquakes, all of that, of course. But then on top of that, things like confiscation, things like rates, things like taxation, because, and again, there's some challenges here, but the New Zealand, you own a home, you're a sitting duck for rates increases. And I was talking to someone recently, and they just said they've had a 20% rate hike for their property. And I think, man, you can't run away from that. And I think that's part of this mega political change that we saw, and so that the historical example of the move from feudalism towards a modern society, or even further back, the move from nomadic sort of hunter-gatherers through to farm society, it was inevitably resulted in a change in the way taxes were collected, because it's a lot easier to tax a farm, they're a sitting duck, than it is to tax a nomadic tribe. And you've got a capital investment, you've built this thing up, you've built up a house or farmland. That makes you the first place that people are going to come and say, hey, can you cough up? And so I think there's some challenges there.
Okay, so from what I'm gathering so far in terms of like that question, why wouldn't you want to own a home? So far, I'm kind of getting that there's some specific issues with this nation in particular, but then there's also an issue that you would have with the whole concept of a nation state anyway. And you see property potentially as being like Hotel California, right? Once you get in, you just can't get out, and it's a trap to be basically taxed to death. I know I'm being extreme, but am I getting warm there?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely warmer. And again, I'm approaching all of this with a dichotomy. I mean, man, I might end up just retiring to Havelock North one day and having a good old life, And so I say this somewhat in kind of two minds, kind of where it stands today. I think I don't see. Again, I don't see the value proposition there. I think there's a lot of structural changes, and if I compare it with, say, the opportunity with something like Bitcoin, which is money that's unconfiscatable, that I can take it with me. I can go overseas and do what I need to do and actually build my career up professionally, and it's a lot cheaper as well.
You move on, right? Yeah, like if you don't like the place to move on. But let's talk about that though, because again, that's almost like an idea born out of the Sovereign Individual book again, from what I understand, right? The idea that these governments are service providers. I love this concept, by the way. Governments are service providers. The people are in charge, and the people engage a service provider. And if they're not doing any good, then they either fire that provider or they move to another country or jurisdiction where they're being treated better. And you get this situation where these service providers, these governments, are effectively competing and under competitive pressure to provide a better place so that they can attract you with lower taxes, better services, better opportunities. Is that just a bunch of idealism, or is that actually possible? Have we seen any examples of that starting to happen in the world?
It's funny because there's kind of two, that what you just said, but in two ways is kind of happening at the same time, because there's the service provider of the welfare state government, which I think is challenging because it kind of tries to be everything for everyone, and you've got just a country of unheard of amounts of public sector employees, and then you've got the lightweight government of an actual nimble service provider, and so there's kind of these two almost competing realities. And I remember I bumped into someone on the street the other day, a friend of mine from jiu-jitsu, and he was saying he works in the Ministry of Social Development around making sure the customers, they call these people customers, are happy with the service they're getting in terms of how they get their benefits and the interface and all of that. And I thought that was really interesting. So there is like little murmurs where the existing government structure, it's trying to approach its relationship with citizens as kind of that customer focus. Is it a good user experience? Is it easy? That sort of thing. But I think the fundamental concept of a government that does all things, and it's just sometimes ridiculous, some of these ministries and departments and steering groups they have. You probably never heard of them, but they're spending millions of dollars on stuff that's pretty useless. I don't see that as a lightweight, nimble government. I see that as bloat. Coming back to like this idea that well, what if you just go to the place where things are good? And I think providing some context of like what that might look like, and so New Zealand, I think people still have this image that it's a safe, nice place to live. It's it's good, and I mean certainly it has that brand image, but I just have a look at crime as the one that stands out for me. Like this isn't the New Zealand I grew up in, where dairy owners are getting murdered. People are doing ram raids, all of that stuff, and it's more up your way, but still we get a lot of it here. And straight away I look at that and I'm like, oh, what happened? Because I feel a million times safer walking down the streets of Tokyo, Taipei, Bangkok, Shanghai than I do in Auckland or Hamilton or Christchurch. You know what I mean? And it's just been this slow transition. And so, so straight away, that's one thing that's off. You look at healthcare, and this is a real shocker. I mean, honestly, man, I actually don't have a GP. It's hard to get one in Wellington, and it's just a mission. And I compare that with my experience in other countries, and I think, man, I'm happy to pay. I'm happy to just go and be served and be in and out, and the way we've done it here, it's like we've tried to make it into a service, but we've done it so poorly and with this kind of grand scale that everything just kind of sucks. And so if you know what I mean? Like honestly, I remember I got sick. I got a bit ill when I was in Thailand last, and I just walked 5 minutes to the nearest hospital. Someone saw me within 15 minutes. I got some medicine and saw a really qualified doctor. Great facilities, and I compare that to the 10-hour wait last time I had to go to the emergency room with someone in Wellington, and just the utter kind of the humiliation of just sitting there, people with broken arms and stuff. And it's like unless you're dying on the floor, they're not going to go and see you. And it's like, what? How did we get to that point? That's not what I paid for. That's not what I signed up for.
No, and it hurts. Like the more you pay in tax, it hurts because you want that money to be spent well to actually improve things. That's what you've been sold. That's what you've been told. But you're not even getting to see the doctor when your kid has an ear infection. Like you've got to go at some ungodly hour at night.
I think the idea that taxes are somehow paying for that is a fallacy as well. I mean, they're not. I mean, this country's living in debt. It's just we're in this transition between, I think, a society that is financially sound and actually tax intake is then being prudently spent on the things where it needs to be spent, and then a society that's just free for all, and it's kind of the optics of that. You're looking at $40,000 farewell parties for executives of some ministry that no one's ever heard of, and I think, man, that's how many people's tax take has been consumed in a farewell dinner.
That's just offensive.
That's a sign, though, and this is something that they mention in the Sovereign Individual, sort of as you get to the end of these mega political phases, kind of the resentment and the kind of skepticism and cynicism towards the existing power structure becomes so palpable, towards the end of, say, the Holy Roman Church and its sort of role in feudal society. People just had such disrespect and kind of hatred for the low-level clergy who were just seen as milking it, and they had all the land, all the goods, they're getting their tithe on top of that. And we're seeing that now. It's like we have this kind of class of political actors who are just sort of waddling around, spending money willy-nilly because they know the gravy train's going to run out, so they'll just get in while they can. Yeah. And if you're invested in that system, though, it's really hard. It's kind of cognitive dissonance to be like, well, maybe I can, if I vote for the right person, it's going to fix all this. But I don't think so.
Yeah. Would you say, like, obviously you have friends that are probably at a similar age and stage as you, and perhaps similar views or opposing views, is my suspicion as well. Is this in your view, is this a growing population within New Zealand that is starting to feel like this? Like there's a growing movement, almost like trying to push a Rage Against the Machine type thing?
Certainly, I think this is not a popular movement. I don't think this is very common at all. I don't think there's. I think most people would be just as you said. Young people think they still have the dream. They still aspire to be part of the nation of New Zealand. Certainly, friends and family of mine are in that position. I think the challenge, though, is if you play that scenario out, and again, this can go many ways, but if you play that scenario out, what are you left with? if the people who see another way, they disappear, you're left with a nation of landed gentry and then beneficiaries. It's kind of the two ends, right? You've got, the guy who's got a portfolio of houses on this end, and then a kind of aura building, public, social housing on this end. And those are the only people who own a house, and, have belonging. And then there's this, I think also that the relationship of New Zealand to the global stage, like the people who just sort of work locally, they've got a job here, they're just kind of just trying to have, live their life. They're not going to be able to compete or work in a position that's actually creating much wealth. And so you start creating, having this society, this aspect of society that's, they haven't got anything, they're sort of unattached. And I think that's where you start seeing the social problems emerge, and then it becomes a sort of a feedback loop. And so it's not like a single dimension I'm looking at here. It's sort of like, and again, this is all just, ideas, but if you've got a New Zealand that's uncompetitive, rural sector gets destroyed, regulated out of existence. You've got, service sector workers who are struggling, cost of living, inflation continuing to eat away at their purchasing power. They're never going to own a house. Maybe they're renting. They're less interested in being part of, the social fabric. You've got these kind of landed gentry beneficiaries, all these people ultimately unproductive, pretty low efficiency. They're not going to be able to compete with a country that's actually, or, people of a country who are, innovative, pushing forward, and not bound and limited by that way of thinking. And that's where I see the longer term trajectory, unless there's some major changes, where New Zealand becomes a low income country, it becomes less productive. And we have these kind of legacy things from the 20th century, from the 19th century, that have kind of continued to make us feel like we're actually developed and wealthy, but actually we're slowly losing it over time. And the people who get out, they get out, but the people who stay in, they're sort of locked into that death spiral, perhaps.
Take me to a happy place, Cody. Take me to an orange place. So let's talk about one of the solutions, because we kind of, probably in the imagination of many listening, they might be thinking, well, surely there's a country, or there's even a shipping container somewhere we can all live in, where we're safe from all this, and we can set our own rules and be the masters of our own destiny, right? But it doesn't have to be a physical place, does it?
Well, I think, again, and I am conscious that this is coming off pretty, it seems negative, right? But the reality is, I think for your generation, for my parents' generation, people, you guys are going to be fine. Like this is still, I think, a long way away. Things take their time to get here. And who knows, something else might happen in the meantime. But I think you only have to throw your mind back to the 1980s, if you may, and sort of what New Zealand was, or then you go back further to the 60s and socialist New Zealand and sort of where we were sort of post-war. And you look at sort of the decades, and it was sort of slowly but surely things have changed. And so I think the New Zealand of 1960 or 1970 of state houses, of full employment, of the state sector managing everything. In a way, we're so far from that, but in the other direction, we're also very close to coming back to that. And I don't know. Maybe it all works out. But in terms of what my approach and sort of what I'm looking at here, I don't think it's a collective, that we can go and there's this magical place we can go to. I think it comes back to the individual and back to the family, and to families making decisions for the way they approach, the life and sort of these major decisions. And so some of the principles that I come back to are things like dynamism and motion. So if things suck in a place, get out. You can discover a lot by traveling and going to other countries, and business opportunities, developing your skills, being kind of dynamic in that sense, I think is really powerful. But also the ability of doing things like remote work, broadening your horizon beyond what New Zealand, just the islands of New Zealand. You do need to be working globally, and I think kind of a success strategy is looking at what's happening in the world, and maybe you live here and you're domiciled in New Zealand, but I think success looks like making US dollars, making Bitcoin, making projects and work happen globally, and then you can kind of bring that back here. And as things sort of crumble around you, you've still got this, something that's solid. And so I think it's an approach to work as well. So it's sort of an approach to living, being dynamic, being able to talk to people, being able to go and see what's on the other side, but then also your approach to working. So I think the employee-employer relationship, I think there's some real challenges there. I think, most people are going to end up in sort of some sort of contract work where it's, you're on demand, and kind of, unless you're a government employee with, juicy benefits and a KiwiSaver, most people, I think, are going to find that increasingly hard to come by as times get tough. And so your ability to get work from overseas and that is going to be really important. But at the same time, you're going to be competing with everyone else for that, and so there's going to be a lot of dynamics. And I don't know, but I think it's going to be interesting, and certainly I think looking at in a specific place, you talk about El Salvador. I mean, that's sort of one example of a place that's in an ascendancy. Other parts of Southeast Asia, other parts of Africa are in this ascendancy where I often think it's like you've got scooters and skyscrapers. That's what you want. You want people on the street who are struggling to make ends meet, but they're struggling in a good way, and they've gone from having less yesterday and more today, even if they're still pretty low down, as opposed to a country that's like it's in the descendancy, and we had more yesterday than we have today, and the difference in trajectory of those two things is sort of, I guess, the underlying theme that I'm looking at here.
Yeah, so there's like a crossover point where the descendancy meets the ascendancy of another nation, and then it's like there's your indicator, right? Where if you're optimizing for all things, you would then shift where you're domiciled from. But financially, at the very least, what you're saying before is interesting. So increasing your sources of revenue so that increasingly they come out of New Zealand, so that I guess that makes it easier to up sticks and move to another country if required, right? But also the type of income or the type of wealth we tried to build. I'm curious just to dig into your views on Bitcoin a little bit more, because none of this would be that exciting, or none of this would have any hope in it at all unless there was something new, like the creative part of the creative destruction that seems to be happening when things are descending. There's actually another cool story of something else that's being built. So how do you approach wealth building? So let's go back to the start. House is largely financialized. If you don't want to buy into that, you don't see value in that, then obviously you want to put your value into something. And I know you're a Bitcoiner, so why don't you tell me about that? How you view Bitcoin as your way of building wealth?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard money. It's for people who are into gold and that sort of thing. I mean, it's like that, but way better. Basically, and you can carry it around with you in your pocket. No matter how much you've got. And so for me, that's it's so easy, and sort of looking at KiwiSaver, looking at these different kind of schemes and investment vehicles and things, and I think, man, why do we have all of this complexity? Why should I have to care about investing in companies that I don't really know much about? I think it's if you've got a company that you're working in, I think it's a good idea, or that your friends are working in, it's a good idea to learn about it. And if there's an opportunity to invest in that, I think that's could be a great idea. But if you're just looking at index funds, and you're looking at KiwiSaver and you're trying to target a certain return, it's like you're not even investing in anything. You're just you're investing. You're investing in the success of the nation, the market, and the nation, right?
Yeah.
And that can all go away. And I don't know. That just, for me, that's the risk.
Yeah.
And obviously you can't put money in a bank account anymore. So it's like, well, what are you going to do with it? You can put it in this asset such as Bitcoin, that is, it's got a hard supply. It's provably scarce. It's really hard to come by, and it's been around, and in its current form, it's been around for 13, 14 years now, without any issues. It's just, it just keeps on going, and I look at that number and I'm like, okay, well, every day that I've got more satoshis, I'm a little bit richer, and everything else is just background noise. Because a house can be taken away from you, gold can be confiscated, stocks can get frozen, liquidated, there can be capital controls, all sorts of shenanigans. And
Yes.
I mean, I just look at, I often tell the story about my friend from Zimbabwe. They had to escape with the clothes on their back, and I don't think that's an unrealistic scenario. We live in a free, kind of relatively free banking system at the moment, but when things start getting difficult and the New Zealand dollar goes in the wrong direction, you bet they're going to start looking at capital controls, and they're going to start trying to tweak the way that you can spend your money. And so even the money that you have isn't yours. Your stock ownership, if you do some if you look into it, that stuff can be frozen, assets can be taken from you. And I don't know, that the idea of true ownership, I think, has only become possible with Bitcoin. You've got your 12-word seed phrase. It's your Bitcoin. No one can take it. There's something profoundly liberating about that, and I don't think that idea has fully caught on with most people yet. Because once it does, it's going to be ridiculous. But
Well, certainly
yeah,
in certainly in countries like New Zealand and like other countries, I'm sure, where we have a relatively functioning government and financial system and high degree of faith in it, uh, maybe because of ignorance, we probably don't see it. Like the Moa, you could say, just kind of waiting to be slaughtered would be an extreme way of putting it. But I always kind of look at the way that people invest as, yeah, it's a blend between having concentrated strategies and diversified strategies. One will maybe that does pay off and it pays off really big, but the other one, it's not going to be as much of a massive payoff, but you're investing in the market and that takes care of you. But what you're saying is that if we zoom out and look at this a little bit differently, everything is concentrated within a system which arguably is going through some degree of phenomenal change, the rate of which we can't really gauge that very well. We don't know if it's going to be all of a sudden, all at once, there's a catalyst, or it's just going to slowly happen over decades. But either way, it's going through a change. And so if you're still investing according to how you always have in the same things, you are actually concentrated in a style or a flavor, even an asset type that was from the past, not necessarily from the future, right? Do you kind of think of it like that with Bitcoin, that this is probably the only thing that gives me peace when I'm putting my value into something?
absolutely. I think, I mean, even just the meta analysis here of what investing is and why it's even relevant. Like, it's because you've got surplus value and you've got money burning a hole in the bank. The inflation's burning your money's melting away through your fingers, and so you need to invest it in something. But if we flip that with a hard money standard, so a completely different reality, but certainly one that's kind of emerging.
Hard money in the context of Bitcoin. What do you mean by that?
So fixed supply. So that's kind of hard money, right? So it can't be printed.
Mm, yeah.
You can't print gold. So in that sense, having hard money, it really changes the dynamic. And so the idea of investing, under hard money, you just maybe you have gold coins or something. You just put them away, and you sit on them.
Mm,
Unless there's a business venture, again, something maybe that your friend or your family members like undertaking that you're directly involved in, and there's a real clear opportunity for you to be part of that.
mm,
There's not really a use case for investing. It's
yeah.
maybe it's the domain of professionals, but in terms of like me and my friends and my colleagues having to have like a KiwiSaver account that's investing into something or whatever, it's like I mean, it's ridiculous, And how could you expect? I mean, obviously you're a professional, but how could you expect a normal person to even have a look at that and understand that?
Mm,
And the answer is you can't. It's not possible. And so you've got people playing around with sharesies,
yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's a video game.
That's my frustration with this whole thing, because like I'm in the industry. I'm trying to encourage people to invest, and I'm trying to encourage people to lower their time preferences. So that just means that they want to take some of their value today and throw it into the future and defer immediate gratification for something better tomorrow, right? But the way to do that is to, I guess, show or prove the incentive to do that. Like, for example, hey, if you buy an investment property, it always goes up, hopefully, over time. If you put it into a well managed share portfolio, that always goes up over time. That's great. But when the faith in that narrative starts to be challenged, or dare I say, if it starts to fail occasionally, then people kind of bring their preference they want to consume more. And I guess from an inflation point of view, hey, that's actually a risk, right? If more people start consuming more today rather than deferring consumption today for a better return tomorrow, that can really mess up the economy. So faith in future assets paying off better. It's kind of hard baked into the system. So what I find with Bitcoin that's really helpful when I talk to people about it is that it's the ultimate type of investment, because you really are putting faith in something that is not really proven by history necessarily, not directly. It's proven by mathematics. What can you have faith in easier, mathematics or a chart of the last 50 years, you know?
If I can put it simply, like, what's my investment strategy is like just to get as much Bitcoin as possible.
It's a good
um,
strategy, man.
and then the way I do that is I invest in myself, and so I treat myself like, I am a business. I am the capital, and so I develop IP. I develop I've got a few different projects going on, as you know, and so I work on that, and I try to encourage those around me to do that. And this is where some of the Bitcoin principles come through around proof of work and building and being focused on outcomes, because a house doesn't produce any value. An index fund does not produce any value. However, if you have a business, or you're running something, that creates value, and it puts value into the world, and you get paid for that value. And if you can, you get paid in fiat or whatever, but if you can then go and use that to buy Bitcoin, you're basically taking your surplus value and you're putting it into something that has a fixed supply. Okay, it's scarce, and so no matter what happens, there's only so much of it, and as more people get onto that network, the value of what you've got increases. And at that point, people may think, well, doesn't that require faith that people are going to continue to want to get into that and be part of that? But actually, the way Bitcoin works, it's like it doesn't really matter, because you've got the halving cycle, which basically means every 4 years you've got this reduction in the supply of new Bitcoin coming online, which pretty much coincides with the bull market, and the number go up trajectory of Bitcoin. And so it's kind of like, you're going to get in eventually. And if someone's not a Bitcoiner yet, they will be at some point in the future. And it's just up to them to kind of decide at what point that's going to be. And it's like, then I sleep easy that that's sort of the way to go.
Okay.
And I can just focus on my business,
Well, I like what you're saying there about that. How does Bitcoin change the incentive structure in your world then?
So the incentives, obviously I want to get as much Bitcoin as possible. So I work hard, but I'm after it for the long term. So, we're talking, 10, 12, 16 years, plus, right, down the future, in the future. So I'm incentivized to create as much value as possible while minimizing my consumption right now, leading a minimalist life. I'm not interested in the fluff, I don't need the boat.
Yeah.
And in a way that's like, I think, a lot more dynamic, and
So it's encouraging you to work harder. It's encouraging you to take risk with business activities. It's encouraging you to defer consumption and spend money on things that you need, not the fluff, like you say, right?
Yeah, and that, in a way, that's sort of the investment strategy. I think is, you gotta hustle. It's like no one's going to give it to you on a silver platter. You got to work hard, but
Yeah.
having, it's the goal isn't, oh, I'm going to get a house and going to do this and that. It's like that. I mean, maybe that's part of it, but as we talked before about, maybe I get a house overseas or whatnot, but
That's right.
it's not the golden goose that I'm aiming for here, because I just don't see it necessarily holding its value long term. And you can't do anything with it. You've got a house. It's like, to try and sell that, to liquidate that or whatever, it's a mission, right? Whereas Bitcoin, it's money, right? It's easy peasy. You just use it for what it's designed for.
Yeah.
And it's the best form of savings, the best form of money ever invented. So it's it's a no-brainer, and it certainly makes my life a lot easier, not having to worry about all the other stuff.
It's beyond every other jurisdiction when you're holding Bitcoin, right? You're holding a form of money that arguably is accepted all over the world, or at some stage it probably will be. And so, unlike a property as a store of wealth or a home as a store of wealth, you're really confined to that jurisdiction, and you have to liquidate it, translate it into a currency, and then move it somewhere else, obviously with tax and restrictions. Whereas with Bitcoin, effectively, you have 12 words in your mind. You can go anywhere you want, and no matter how much wealth you have, it goes with you.
Let's contextualize this as well. So, I don't know if you're aware, there's a huge property crisis right now in China. I had a friend recently go back there, and I mean, it's not getting heaps of media coverage in New Zealand, but basically the fallout from the Evergrande
Yeah.
bankruptcy and that. But basically, I think let's get this straight. I think there will always be value for heritage homes. Maybe one day, I think it'd be nice, have an old Wellington villa,
Yeah.
native timber. I mean, that will always have value. It's like fine art. Okay, someone's going to want it because of the architect and because of the history and the provenance of it. But if you look at, say, what's happening in Christchurch and parts of Auckland, you've got investment houses built to order, built from a kit set. There's no art value. There's no legacy value. It is an investment vehicle purely, and that I think that's the bit there where
Yeah.
the houses that I think people are looking at, in apartments, it's not even a house anymore. It's like a box. It's a box of sky that's tied to a body corporate, that's tied to, the building's seismic rating and all of this stuff. It's like, man, you don't own anything. And the Chinese kind of had it right. They do 99-year leases on houses. No one owns a house in China. It's all leased from the party. And in a way, like they still, I mean, there's still this really frothy property market, but I think there are some houses and some, beachfront property and things like that, which will always have value, right? And it's, it's a collectible, it's a one-off.
Yeah.
But the if everyone's, trying to aim for that, they're going to build more and more. And, you can always build more houses and you can turn more farmland into housing estates and stuff. I don't know. I don't see that playing out in a way that's positive or constructive.
Okay. Some of this would be uncomfortable for a lot of people listening to this, and I apologize that you're not comfortable if that's you. It's like I would suggest, hey, you kind of have to get used to that if you're trying to get prepared for the world to come. We have to look at everything for what things are, not what we always just want them to be. And a lot of the future, like my personal belief, is that it's probably going to be a lot similar to the past, but happening a lot faster and a bit more weird. Um, but then also there's a growing possibility that things will never be the same. And so I think
Yeah.
we have to kind of diversify across both of those headspaces, which requires a certain amount of tension between opposing ideas. Like one is buy a property as soon as you can, pay down the debt, invest in KiwiSaver and a few other things. The other one is basically work as hard as you can and convert your surplus value into hard money, which isn't under the thumb of a government.
Yeah, and I think, look, again, being clear, I'm running this kind of a couple of different scenarios here. I go back to Hastings again. I go to my grandparents' place and I say, man, this place has not changed in 20, 30 years, and there's still moments like that, and so it may come across as extreme, but I'm just positing kind of one way of looking at this. And I mean, we could have a conversation about what old New Zealand is and how it was, and in many ways how it's still there in many parts of New Zealand. But I think that doesn't really matter in the face of the global macro changes that are happening and the mega political changes. And the kind of the reality that we've talked about today is Bitcoin, a laptop, and a passport is all you need to be successful and to survive. And being stuck, with a home and kind of trying to defend that, trying to navigate that reality. I can see that a reality where that becomes more and more challenging. And you'll get people who hold on to the very end, but all of the kind of putting it all into a pot and mixing it together, I see challenges, I see trauma, I see the ability of the state to come in and take things, and its ability to control what you do, and reactionary politics, all of that playing a role in making it very challenging. And look, I think houses will always have value. Maybe for some people that's all they can aspire to, but I don't see that being a pathway for long-term success in a Bitcoin world, in a globalized world, in a world without a United States hegemon, multipolar world. Maybe you got to get up and go, and it's not nice, but it's what people did in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Greece, Lebanon, these different countries.
Yeah.
They got out, and are you going to be wanting to sit here holding the bags, with your house, or are you going to be the one on the plane with nothing? Because if you got Bitcoin, you can take it with you, but if you don't, you can't. So,
wow. Okay, that's a real
Sorry.
voice from the watchtower there. Telling us what might be coming. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Cody, tell me a little bit about the Transformation of Value podcast before we finish up. Love your work. a lot of those episodes, just unbelievable production quality, the guests, the conversation, the questioning, the answers. So where can people find you and find that podcast?
Yeah. So the transformation of value is my podcast. It's New Zealand's only Bitcoin. Well, it's New Zealand's most popular Bitcoin only podcast. It's really focused on how Bitcoin and associated decentralization and these kind of mega political changes we've talked about today, how that all just kind of comes together. So you can find it, on your favorite podcasting app. Just look for the transformation of value. I'm also on Twitter, TTOV podcast. And yeah, just search it up or search for me, Cody Ellingham, and you'll find me. Listen along. We certainly try to find a mix of New Zealand and international guests to try and, broach different topics and how it all connects back to our situation, and I guess just some of the broader changes and challenges that we're facing in the world. So yeah, I really enjoy it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Cody.
Thank you.